right, this is part 2 of the Human Adaptation lecture that will go along with Chapter 5 of the Essentials textbook or Chapter 13 through 14 of the Explorations textbook. All right, so we are continuing on learning about human adaptation and the various factors that will affect humans. All right, this is part 2 of the Human Adaptation lecture that goes along with Chapter 13 through 14 of the Explorations textbook or Chapter 5 of the Essentials textbook. So the next few slides we're going to start getting into the various types of adaptations in humans. There are going to be 4 different levels of adaptations that we'll talk about. Grandmothering would be a great example of a cultural adaptation. Humans are one of the only species that have high levels of post-reproductive survival, meaning that humans survive well past their reproductive years. So one of the main hypotheses or theories as to why this may be happening for humans, why it's advantageous for us to live so long, is grandmothering. Grandmothering is essentially the idea that grandmothers and grandfathers even are able to contribute not only to the reproductive success of themselves, but also to their children and grandchildren. So I'm sure you've all heard the saying that it takes a village. It takes a village to be able to support very dependent children. Human children are very dependent upon their parents and grandparents for survival, well through the prenatal and postnatal and even into adulthood stages. So it's considered to be part of human adaptive success. Post-reproductive survival is high in humans. And women play a very large role in caring for not only their children, but also their grandchildren. So grandmothering is considered to be a common cross-cultural strategy that helps enhance the survival of children. All right, so these are the 4 levels of adaptations in humans. So the first level is going to be genetic adaptations. So genetic adaptations operate on the population level, and these are actually coded for in our genetic material, in our DNA. So a genetic adaptation would be something that you could identify by looking at someone's genome, if you're able to look at the karyotype and look at all the various different loci, the locations of genes on the chromosomes. You can determine a human's genetic adaptations. So some examples of this would be the heterozygote advantage in the sickle cell anemia case that we learned about in Chapter 4. So if you recall, those that are heterozygous, the AS genotype at the locus that determines hemoglobin, those individuals do not have sickle cell anemia. However, they are resistant to malarial infection. So that provides them a reproductive advantage and a survival advantage if they happen to live in a region where malaria is endemic. Some other examples of genetic adaptations, there's an adaptation that gives some humans resistance to HIV infection. There's an adaptation in the Baja population that allows for a slightly enlarged spleen, which actually makes them more effective at underwater hunting. There's a great clip in this week's module that will talk about the Baja and their underwater hunting adaptations. So remember, genetic adaptations are at the population level, and they are coded for in our DNA. The second level of human adaptation would be developmental adaptations. So just like it sounds, developmental adaptations would happen during the developmental phases, so either during the prenatal or the postnatal. So some good examples of this: human populations, children that are born at higher altitude, by adulthood tend to have larger lung capacity and lung volume. And this allows them to be able to take in more oxygen in these hypoxic conditions. A hypoxic condition is a condition with lower oxygen content. So larger chest capacity for humans that are born at high altitude, that would be a developmental adaptation. Physiological adaptations are also sometimes called acclimatization. So physiological adaptations operate on the individual level, and they can happen to human beings at any stage in their life cycle during the prenatal, postnatal, or adult stages. And these adaptations can happen relatively quickly, even within minutes. So vasodilation is going to be an adaptation to extreme heat and also to hypoxic conditions. So vasodilation is essentially the blood vessels expanding or becoming more wide. So that makes it easier for red blood cells to pass through and reach vital organs. So your red blood cells are carrying oxygen. So vasodilation makes it more effective for the body to transport oxygen to these vital organs. So that's vasodilation. Vasoconstriction is the opposite. Vasoconstriction is blood vessels becoming more narrow or constricted. So vasoconstriction is an adaptation to extreme cold. If you think about an extreme cold, if you ever notice your fingertips or your toe tips becoming kind of whitish in color, that's because vasoconstriction is occurring. All of your blood is being channeled towards your core, because when you think about it, in your core, that's where all your vital organs are located, your heart, your lungs, your spleen, your liver, etc., etc. So if your body is trying to acclimatize and trying to survive, it's going to channel all of that vital oxygenated blood into your core. Sweating, or more specifically evaporative cooling. So humans, we are unique in our abilities to evaporatively cool. We are not necessarily hairless, but we are furless. We don't have excess hair on any part of our bodies except for our head. And that allows for more effective evaporative cooling. It's not actually the sweat itself. It's not the liquid that cools you down. It's the process of evaporation. So as the sweat evaporates off of naked skin, it has the purpose of cooling down our body. So that's a physiological adaptation to extreme heat. And then shivering, that's a physiological adaptation to extreme cold. Level 4 is going to be behavioral, or also sometimes called cultural adaptations. So in humans, this is going to obviously occur at any stage in our life cycle. So some examples would be the type of clothing that we wear. The type of clothing that we wear in extreme heat is obviously quite different than the clothing that we wear at extreme cold. Same thing for housing structures, also things like heat and air conditioning, the type of roofs that we put on our houses, subsistence patterns, that's the type of food that we consume and the way that we obtain our food. The incest taboo could be considered a cultural practice that also has a biological function. Because oftentimes if individuals that are too closely related together are breeding with one another, it may be more likely that recessive and genetic disorders may come out in the gene pool. Now, that's not always true. It's certainly very possible. Many cultures, in fact, practice cross-cousin marriage. So that's not always the case. It's just looking at the incest taboo. If this happens generation after generation, it may be more likely that these individuals would have recessive or genetic disorders. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how humans adapt to extreme heat. So humans are actually the best at this, quite simply because we've had the most time, or the most number of generations, to adapt to climate stress as far as heat stress goes. So the body will attempt to maintain core body temperature and homeostasis under hot conditions through both vasodilation and sweating. So we talked about both of those in the previous slide. Vasodilation is the blood vessels getting wider and expanding, and sweating, or the process of evaporative cooling, is that process of sweat evaporating on naked skin, which helps to cool down your core. And humans have a very strong ability to adjust to heat. Our earliest ancestors originated on the African savanna. Our ancestors, hominins, have been around about 6 million years, and Homo sapiens have been around between 200 to 300,000 years. So we've quite simply had more generations to adjust to this climate stress. So we are the best at this. All right, cold stress. So the human body will struggle to maintain body temperatures at cold extremes through both vasoconstriction and shivering. So vasoconstriction, again, is blood vessels becoming more narrow or constricted, and channeling that oxygenated blood to your core where your vital organs are located. And of course, there's also cultural adaptations such as warmer clothing, shelter, fire, heaters. These are all cultural adaptations to extreme cold. All right, so also your body shape. So there's Bergman's rule and Allen's rule. So in general, human beings that have ancestors that are in colder regions are going to be shorter and stouter. And then humans that have ancestors in hotter regions are going to be taller and lankier. So Bergman's rule is stating that heat-adapted mammals will have a higher surface area to body ratio. And Allen's rule is stating that heat-adapted mammals will have longer limbs. So there's a film clip that I'm going to have you guys watch in this week's module that's going to look at, it's a section from a film on Neanderthals versus Homo sapiens. So the clip I'm going to have you guys watch, the link is in your module. You're going to start at 12 minutes and end at 20. And they're going to do an experiment where they have two different humans in an ice bath. One human that's taller and lankier and another human that's shorter and stouter. And they're going to determine which human is more adaptable to that extreme cold. All right, so humans will also adapt to hypoxic conditions. So a hypoxic condition is lack of available oxygen or low oxygen content. So these are mainly high altitude adaptations. So the body will respond initially. So these are physiological adaptations here. The body responds initially through the production of extra red blood cells and hemoglobin. Remember, those red blood cells are carrying oxygen to your vital organs, and also increasing the diameter of blood vessels, which is called vasodilation. So those born at high altitude will also have a larger lung volume and larger chest cavity, as well as the above characteristics. So these traits here, the vasodilation and production of extra red blood cells, that's a physiological adaptation. And then this next one down here, the expanded lung volume and chest cavity, that's a developmental adaptation. So this will only occur if that human was born in hypoxic conditions. All right, so there's also some clips in this week's module that are going to tell you more about hypoxia, about human adaptation to high altitude conditions. All right, so let's talk about nutritional adaptations. So each human body requires a certain amount of energy and nutrients in order to function. So that's our basal metabolic requirements. Even if we were just sitting around watching TV all day, we would still need to consume calories in order to keep our organs functioning properly. So essentially, the more active you are, the more calories you need. So very active populations may need way more than that typical 2,000 calorie diet. They may need 3,000 to 4,000 calories if they're extremely active. Whereas populations that tend to be more sedentary require less calories for maintaining homeostasis. So most populations are what we consider undernourished and consume too few calories, under 2,000 calories per day. Efforts to combat this problem have resulted in new nutritional issues. So a decline in the diversity of food. If we're trying to produce food that's cheap and easy to produce, like rice and corn and beans, this is reducing the overall diversity. And as these plants are bred generation after generation, we're looking for characteristics that are beneficial to humans and feeding large amount of humans, but that's not necessarily beneficial for the diversity of these plants and animals. So currently efforts are focused on increasing the nutritional quality of both rice and corn. Individuals with poor nutrition will also, as a result, have weaker immune systems. So in addition, undernourished populations often live in areas with sanitation issues. So it's kind of this double-edged sword. A weak immune system and unsanitary living conditions can result in the quick spread of disease. And disease is also what we call a density-dependent factor, meaning that if you live in an area that has a really dense population, that has a very high population, it's more likely that these diseases will spread quickly. A common, recent example is with COVID, with the coronavirus. Those regions that are very highly populated and densely populated tend to see higher infection rates because obviously if you're living in very close quarters with other individuals, it's more likely that you would spread a virus to somebody else. So just envision, if we were all jam-packed into a classroom, 40 of us into a classroom, if one of us had COVID, it would be more likely that it would spread to others. Whereas if we're in a region where we're dense, where we're sparsely populated and practicing social distancing, it's less likely that these diseases are passed from person to person. All right, so dietary excess is also a severe problem. It's just as severe as dietary lack. Much of the Western world and developed world struggles with this. Today's domesticated animals contain more saturated fats than do the animals that were domesticated 15,000 years ago. So we see increases in type 2 diabetes, high cholesterol, cardiac disease, stroke, etc., etc. So the way that we practice animal husbandry in modern day, we're oftentimes, again, looking for those characteristics that provide the highest caloric or the most nutritional food. But sometimes what that results in is, especially when we're producing meat, is meat that has very high fat and high cholesterol. Sometimes domesticated animals are also given steroids and antibiotics, which causes a whole host of other issues. All right, so this TED Talk is also in your module this week. This TED Talk is going to talk about human diet and our capacity for cooperation. It's looking at the Hazda population, which is a group of hunter-gatherers. So this clip is going to give you a good idea of how hunter-gatherers practice animal husbandry. All right, workload adaptations. So Wolff's Law is stating that bone is produced where it is needed and removed where it is not. So essentially populations that have really high workload, that they're very active. So hunter-gatherer populations that travel long distances, agricultural populations that spend 8 to 10 hours out working in the field, they tend to have much more dense or robust bones. So high activity or high workload populations are going to have more robust or thicker bones, whereas more sedentary populations will have more gracile or more delicate bone morphology. So this is showing you a cross-section of the humerus. So kind of the use it or lose it model. Those of you in lab kind of learned about the use it or lose it. So if you're right-handed, it's likely that your right arm, that your right humerus will be thicker and more robust, and your left humerus will be more gracile. All right, so we're going to go ahead and pause here.